Hello and welcome back to Beyond Boxes. This is a podcast episode, which means that you can listen wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch right here on YouTube. Today, I am so delighted to be joined by Veronica Monet. Welcome, Veronica.
Jaya, thank you so much for having me on your show. I love the title. I love your expansive, open heart, just beyond boxes. I mean, that is really something we all need.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited about the conversation we're about to have. But before we could begin, can you let people know which labels, if any, you identify with?
Yeah, I know identity politics is a little bit fraught. Some people really don't like labels. And when I think about the whole concept about beyond boxes, I think, why are we putting labels? But I also think for me, identity politics was really important because there are so many marginalized groups of people. And so it started off for me actually when I went into recovery as an alcoholic and an addict. So I consider myself a recovering addict alcoholic, even though I've been clean and sober for 36 years, because I never want to get the kind of hubris that says, oh, that I don't still have the disease of addiction. And then I moved on to bisexual politics. So in the early 90s, I was very active in what we called bi visibility. We were trying to elevate bisexuality to something that was visibly oriented towards the queer community, and not just something that people did, no offense, but in swing parties or something like that, but really an identity that helped us, I think, galvanize around the idea that we thought and acted and saw life maybe a little bit different than straight people. Mm-hmm. And from there, I became a sex worker. So I was in the sex industry for 14 years, and I have been a sex worker rights activist for a quarter of a century. So I consider myself a former sex worker and a sex worker rights activist. I'm also in a polyamorous relationship, have been for 11 years. It's polyfidelitous, which means that I'm not actually having sex with other people except for my partner. It's a poly V. He has a partner and he has me, and we function as a family. Wonderful. So yeah, I think those are enough labels for now.
I love it. And there's a lot there that you've given us, and I think there's a lot that we could talk about today. And I know you work a lot around shame and sex, and that you're a relationship and sex coach now, as well as being a former sex worker and sex worker rights activist. So do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about your journey and how you talked about being a former addict as well, and about being a former sex worker, and these are all topics that can often be really taboo to talk about. So I'm really honored that you're willing to come today and talk about all this so openly.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. I think a lot of people come from dysfunctional families. Certainly that's what I see in my office all day when I'm working with my clients. It really doesn't matter what station in life they have. There's a lot of dysfunction. And I really think patriarchy is dysfunctional. And so it creates a lot of pain and suffering. And then a lot of us are trying to heal from that. So my journey began when I got clean and sober, and I was 25 years old. So it seemed rather young to me to be getting sober, but I had already gotten arrested for drunk driving and had actually just twice injected drugs. So I was hitting a bottom very quickly at a young age. And I'm so grateful that there were 12-step programs for me to go into to get well. Shortly after that, I was 4 years clean and sober. And I realized that I really was bisexual. I thought that was just something that kind of happened accidentally because I was drunk. And now I was finding out, no, it's still really a big part of me. I was actually disappointed at first because I thought I was going to get all good and my mother would be so proud of me finally. And so that was really painful for me, actually. I had a whole coming out process around that. I actually lost some friends. You got to keep in mind, this was 1989. So it wasn't cool and fashionable to be bisexual at that point.
Mhm.
So yeah, I actually lost some friends. That was painful, but I gained new friends. You know, we get a chosen family, which is awesome. And from there, I I'm not going to say I fell in love with her, but I developed a relationship that was very passionate with a woman. And she was married, and her husband, you know, was very aware of the fact that we were having an affair. But she happened to be a prostitute. And I'm college educated, feminist, mind you. So I was a little horrified that that was her profession. And I really thought, you know, maybe I can help talk her out of it. So I dated her for an entire year. And during that time, I started to realize she was one of the happiest, healthiest people I'd ever met. She worked out every day. She didn't drink. She didn't do drugs. She had 3 kids and a husband and a beautiful home. And she drove her little Mercedes convertible. And she always had a smile on her face. And I thought, why do I think I want to rescue her? What am I rescuing her from? And I started realizing, oh my God, you know, actually, I think maybe I'd like her to teach me how to do this, because I started getting very curious about what she was doing. And she did not want to do that. She thought that was an awesome responsibility. And she says, well, once you start, you won't want to quit. And I'm thinking, well, that's silly. Why would that be true? So I threatened her. I told her, you either teach me how to do this, or I am going to, I'm going to do it by myself. Now, I want to highlight something for you. I was an honor student. I graduated with a degree in psychology, a minor in business administration. I had been working in corporate America for 7 years. I had worked as a department manager. I had worked as an office manager. I had worked as a secretary, and I had worked as a marketing consultant for a radio station. I had gotten promotions. I had gotten raises. I had gotten awards. Now, here's this woman who only had a high school education and was working as an escort. Why does she need to teach me anything? See, most people think this is a job for dummies. Well, the way she was doing it, she was operating a small business, and there was a lot to learn. And so I apprenticed to her for 9 months. And the first thing she did was she marched me down to City Hall and made me get a federal ID number so I could start reporting my taxes. So that's how I got my start in that. And I stayed in it. She was right. Once I started, I didn't want to stop. The money was good. And here was the kicker. I went from working at a computer company where the CEOs would ignore me and have me fetch their coffee and make their travel plans and book all their appointments, but sometimes not even bother to learn my name, to suddenly being courted and extolled and elevated by men of the same position and stature. I had no idea that, and I want to caution anybody that's listening to this, I am not speaking for the entire sex industry. I'm talking about a very privileged aspect of it. And that's the only one I would have gone into. I'm clean, I'm sober, I have a college education, extensive corporate experience. So of course, that's where I went. Now, I'm going to talk in a little bit about all the people who don't go into the sex industry in that fashion. But it's really important to acknowledge that some of us do. Really important.
And I definitely want to circle back as well to what you're saying about the other parts of the sex industry. But first, I just want to highlight some of the things you said. And I think it's so important that you were honest about your own prejudices that you had when you met this woman and she was a sex worker. And before you'd educated yourself on the topic, you had that like savior complex. You had that like thinking of her as somehow inferior and that she needed rescuing. And then as you got to know her and got to understand it, you realize that that's not the case. And I really am grateful that you brought that in and you were honest about that, because I think, you know, in society, there is this idea that sex workers sometimes are somehow inferior. And I know that I myself, I like to think I'm super open-minded. You know, I do a lot of work around inclusivity, but I went through my own journey, similar to you in some ways, of, yeah, I used to think of sex workers as this kind of them, you know, there was me and there was them. And I was, you know, I supported sex worker rights and I supported sex workers, but I was separate from all of them, right? And so, and I had this, I guess it was unconscious, but there was definitely a lot of bias there and a lot of, you know, sort of superiority complex there, a bit like what you were talking to. And I went through and I went through my own personal journey where I was at a discussion group and we were talking about, I think, porn and something else. I can't remember exactly, but and the conversation turned to sex work, and I was, you know, talking about, I used to be a pole dancer at the time, and I was very clear that I was a pole dancer, which was sport, and not a stripper, because again, like, I have nothing against strippers, but like, I'm not one of them. And so there was all these kind of thoughts going on for me. And I was voicing this, and we got into this debate about something. And then one of the members there said that she was a sex worker and basically called me out on my bias. And it was incredibly uncomfortable because, you know, I thought of myself as, you know, and when I realized that, and my initial thought, I remember, was like feeling almost like betrayed, like how dare she not tell me in advance that maybe I would have changed my phrasing. And that's when you know you have some work to do, right? When you think, oh, if I'd known she was a sex worker, maybe I'd have said things differently. And in the work I do around inclusivity and power and privilege dynamics and all of that, that's one of the things, is that we have to change the way we think about people so that there isn't a, I'm just being performative around certain people, but in the rest of my life, I can go back to talking the way I want to or is comfortable. So
great point.
Yeah.
Great point. Yeah.
And then, so yeah, so for me, then I remember, so that was the first big wake up call for me. And then I went into a journey of educating myself on the topic. And then I remember also thinking about whether, I had a very close friend who I then found out was also a sex worker, and similar to you, which I learned a lot from her. And I even considered becoming a sex worker myself. I actually did not, for personal reasons and health reasons, but I really loved you sharing about your own journey and how that came about. And so, because we're talking a bit about these ideas and these prejudices that are so easily happen, right? We're both people that if we hadn't actually had close relationships and encountered people who were working as escorts, we would probably have continued thinking the way we did. And we've had such big shifts in our consciousness. So can you talk a little bit about some of the myths that you'd like to debunk around sex work?
Absolutely. And I also just want to say, I have a lot of compassion for any of us, myself included in the beginning, who have these stereotypes about sex workers. But also I want to say that the impulse to draw a distinction, you know, I was at a meeting of sexual energy professionals, and they were mostly people who taught Tantra. And there were a lot of people who identified as dakinis and tantrikas, and it was fascinating. That whole group of people also want you to know that they are not prostitutes and they're not sex workers, which I find a little hilarious in one respect, because a lot of times they're actually doing things that could get you arrested, and they're doing things that are considered sex work. Mm-hmm. But because they're working with Kundalini energy and it has a spiritual reframe to it, they really want to distinguish themselves. I think the impulse to distinguish is rooted in two really important things that we need to call out. And one of them is the fact that you can get arrested. So if you count yourself as a sex worker, you are suddenly a demonized, maligned group of people who could go to jail, maybe even lose your money, lose your house. Under RICO, sometimes they can take everything you own. So it's a very high price to pay to wear that label. And the other thing that I want to say is just as far as patriarchy's establishment, we want to go back 6,000 plus years. We're really talking about the demonization of an aspect of the feminine. And when I say feminine, I'm not talking about gender here. I'm just talking about the feminine, that we demonize that so that we've got the whore and we've got the virgin.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of in our DNA. It's also so ancient that we're kind of programmed to be thinking like that. Are these people good or are they bad? So here's something I want to demystify. Newsflash, sex workers are just people. So, why does somebody get into sex work? I don't know. Which sex worker are we talking about?
Absolutely.
And what is sex work like? Also, I don't know. Which sex worker are we talking about? Because everybody has a different experience of it, a different reason for getting into it. And it has so many different expressions and ways of showing up. So yeah, you could be an erotic dancer in a strip club. And maybe the sex work shows up as just the dancing. Maybe it shows up as actually lap dancing or going into a private booth where you're actually doing what is considered acts of prostitution. Maybe it shows up as webcamming, or you never are even in the same room with your clients. Or it shows up as phone sex. Maybe erotic photos, posing for a men's magazine, in which case I'm sorry to announce to all the actresses and athletes out there that have posed for Playboy, but that suddenly made you a sex worker. I mean, it's just interesting how we have these divisions. Yeah. And interesting is really not the word. It's tragic because there are people considered at the bottom of this hierarchy who suffer the most. They wind up getting raped and murdered and jailed with impunity because they're considered not worth our time of day. These are not people, they're things or something. So lots of people go into the sex industry to fund a college education. They do.
Especially in the US, where
college.
It's so expensive. Especially in the US, college education is so expensive that there aren't many people can actually afford to pay for them unless they come from a super wealthy family.
Totally. So now what we're finding is we've got a lot of former sex workers who have their college diploma and they want to enter another profession, the one they trained for, the one that they had their sights on. And somebody discovers, or they're just out and open about it because they didn't realize that we are still dealing with a lot of prejudice around this, not able to get a job, not able to coach the soccer team that they love.
And it's
really, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, it's just outrageous.
It is.
It's outrageous because what we're basically saying is if you've ever sold sex for money under any circumstances, whether it's a webcam or escorting like I did or street prostitution, we're not going to let you do anything else ever. Mm-hmm. So now we say what you're doing is illegal and you shouldn't be doing it. It's immoral and you need to stop. But by the way, you can't do anything else.
Which is awful. And also not taking into account the fact that the men who are paying, because it's mostly men who are paying for sex work, aren't at all held to the same standards. So it's very clear what you're saying about the role of patriarchy in all of this and the kind of treating sex workers as lesser than. And, you know, I talk a lot about like race and gender and sexuality on this podcast, but this I think is such an important topic where, again, it's that kind of, like you say, the myth that you most want to debunk with the fact that sex workers are just humans. And I think that's true of like so often when we discriminate against groups of people or we generalize groups of people, we're dehumanizing them. Even if we think we're progressive and for the rights of that group of people, once we generalize everyone. And so I love what you're saying about, you know, you can't speak for all sex workers. You can't speak for all types of sex work. You have to, it's different individuals having individual experiences of what it's like within this profession, the same way other people have individual experiences in other professions. I don't have the same experience of being a podcast host as other people do, for example. There's similarities, but there's plenty of differences as well.
There are lots of differences, and it's important to be able to hold all those. For myself as a sex worker activist, I want to hold all of them. And believe me, gender and race are definitely part of this topic. So, and so the most maligned sex workers are the trans women. They are often the ones who are going to be raped, harassed most viciously by the cops, and murdered with impunity. So that's important to call out. Women of color are going to be the most arrested oftentimes. The person who's going to go to jail has got brown skin or black skin. Myself, because I was college educated and white and working for myself and had a website, I didn't get arrested until I had been on television for about 15 years talking about being an escort. And finally, they'd had enough of me. So they audited me, evicted me from the place that I was working, and arrested me. But I had connections, so I didn't do any time. My connections, what were they? As a political activist in San Francisco, we were friendly with the district attorney, and who wasn't actually really wanting to enforce the anti-prostitution laws.
About laws and all of this, let's talk a bit about like the importance of decriminalizing sex work, because but before going to that, I just really want to highlight what you were saying about, you know, just like in every other area of life, there is still a hierarchy within sex work, and that, you know, trans people, people of color, trans women of color are often the bottom of the barrel and end up like, experiencing the worst of like discrimination and oppression. But also it's dangerous. People are getting murdered because of this and arrested, and there's nowhere like, you know, there's nowhere that's safe for them in this moment. And I think
so. When the one time in 14, 15 years that I got arrested, and basically because I was just, you know, egging law enforcement on, I spent a night in jail. Now, I could have bailed myself out, but there were two things going for me. One, I didn't want to give them even that little tiny bit of money. Mm-hmm. And two, I thought, you know, this is an opportunity for me to see what goes on in here. Mm-hmm. So I stayed in that jail cell overnight, and I noticed that all the women in there were women of color, except for myself. They all were not, they didn't have a lot of money or education. And they knew the cops on the other side of those bars. So, and there was a lot of flirtation going on with the police officers. Mm-hmm. So it was really obvious to me that there were sexual favors being traded. And that particular night, they were sweeping the streets, probably because some politician was running for a re-election. And so to appease local business owners, and they clean up the streets for a night, put the women of color in jail, and then, you know, they put them right back out there. Now they've got a $500 fine. Guess how that's going to get paid? Mm. And the only way that they don't go right back into that jail cell is to trade sexual favors with the cops. So I got to see that with my own eyes. I'd heard about it, but I got to see it with my own eyes. So that's one of the things that I want to call out, is that it's just a meat grinder. The other thing is that, yeah, you're absolutely right. People die, and particularly straight prostitutes are going to be murdered. And towards the end of my career, I was for 12 years, perfectly safe, no incidences, great clients. I took a call that I had a bad feeling about. And in this line of work, you cannot ever do anything you have a bad feeling about. You need to really be lined into your intuition. And that's why it really helps to be clean and sober. And I was sober. I was clean and sober, but I've defied my intuition. I went ahead and took this call. Turned out this guy was a serial rapist. And he wasn't violent with me. I just went along with it, knew I wasn't going to get paid, and I got out of there. 3 weeks later, a young woman who had just become an escort visited him, and she resisted, and he stabbed her in the face with a knife.
Oh my God.
Now, I went on a campaign to try to get this guy arrested. I knew where I lived. I knew where he banked. I talked to his banker. But the Oakland Police Department did not want to arrest him. They wanted to arrest me for an act of prostitution. Now, I just want to clarify, an act of prostitution in my state is a misdemeanor, another $500 fine for the city. Arresting a serial rapist who just assaulted a woman with a knife, that's a felony charge. That's an actual violent criminal. To have the standard that you don't care about the violent criminal because he's preying on prostitutes is mind-boggling to me. It's horrendous. It's horrific. But a bunch of us activists got together and we worked on this for about 3 years. And at the time, the Oakland mayor was Jerry Brown, who would eventually become the governor of the state of California. And we had to threaten to go to the press to out his entire administration for ignoring the violence in lieu of wanting to arrest people for a consensual sex act. And so I was allowed to give my deposition in the mayor's office. It did not lead to anything. This man was never arrested. I presume he went on to hurt other people. For all I know, he's got bodies buried somewhere. But I am happy to report that after years of activism, and I want to acknowledge a colleague of mine by the name of Maxine Dugan, who never gave up the fight on this. Senator Scott Wiener finally passed into law in the state of California that prostitutes can actually report their own rapes and assaults without getting arrested. But it took that long. And that's what's on the line here. And so when people want to rescue prostitutes, I just want to let you know, you want to follow the Nordic model, which is, oh, we're going to arrest the clients, which, oh, by the way, we demonize them too, so we call them Johns. No, they're not. They're people too. They have kids and families and jobs. So we're going to arrest them and make them the bad guys. And then we're going to go rescue the prostitutes who probably don't want to be doing this, but have nothing else to do. And there's so many shades of mythology and prejudice in that assumption. But let's say that you're going to rescue the prostitutes. What if they want to go back to it? Oh, and by the way, since you won't let them do anything else, what are they going to do to feed their kids? These are things that are not addressed. But the fact is, there's at least a portion of people who enjoy the sex industry and want to do it. There are those who find that it just is more lucrative than whatever else they're educated or equipped to do. And then there's those that have actually been trafficked. The statistics that we're given about trafficking you can't verify them. And as far as those of us who know the industry, they're inflated drastically, grossly inflated. I remember talking to a vice cop in Miami and asking him, okay, so now you've got these sex trafficking laws and you've developed a whole department to battle sex trafficking. how many people have you rescued? And he told me about this one young woman that he'd rescued from trafficking. And I said, okay, so what happened to her? And he goes, well, she went back to working as a prostitute. It's like, oh, well. Okay, so apparently she didn't really want to be rescued. The thing is that if you are an immigrant and you're not documented, you better say you're sex trafficked, because you're going to get deported. And the best thing you can do is to confess that you are trafficked, so you don't actually have to go to jail. You'll get resources, and then you can quietly go back to the job that you prefer if that's what you really want to do. I'm not saying that some people aren't desperate to get out. I am not saying that some people aren't being imprisoned. But we're never going to find those people unless you've got the sex workers who want to do this working on your behalf, because those are the people that are actually embedded in the industry. Those are the people who know where the voluntary and the involuntary sex work is taking place, but they can't come forward because they're afraid of going to jail.
And I think that's so important. Like, there's a couple of things you've said that I think number one is that when you're advocating for sex worker rights, you're not advocating, sorry. Number one is that when you're advocating for sex worker rights, you're not advocating for sex trafficking. Like, that is totally different. But that by decriminalizing sex work, you can separate that. You can separate the people who are choosing to do it and who can actually aid in finding those who are being imprisoned, who are being entrapped, who are not consenting to doing it. And you protect humans, you protect women. Like you say, this story you gave of the serial rapist who's attacking women with knives, it's awful. And the fact that people didn't care about it because it was sex workers that he was attacking or raping, it just shows how dehumanizing and how dehumanized sex workers are in our culture. And I think that's true of so many different countries. And so I think, you're talking from about different states in the US and from a US perspective, but I think it's true of so many countries and in culture in general to destigmatize sex work so that we can talk about it openly, decriminalize sex work so that we can,
well, so New Zealand decriminalized in 2003. It was so funny. The contingency of sex worker activists from New Zealand were sitting right in front of me at a international conference on prostitution that I was helping to facilitate in Montreal in 2005. And I overheard them saying, and to think, we thought we were going to learn something from the Americans. We're still so backward here. And I wanted to say that we often look at what was it that the gay rights movement got right. And I want to call out how they were able to get America to embrace them. And I'm saying them. I consider myself queer, so I actually kind of think I'm part of that movement. Absolutely. But the thing is that it was gay marriage. This tells us something about a really deep prejudice that runs through Western culture. And it all revolves around family and sex. We have a prejudice towards people who have sex out of marriage. We have a prejudice towards people who are promiscuous. That's one of the reasons that even though gay marriage is now a standard that everybody's embracing because it's family oriented, we still have not been able to make strides with polyamory because it's being seen as promiscuous. Yeah. And sex work has that same onus. Mm-hmm. So we have got to get to some place where we really can start to see sex as something that's a positive and a good, a force for good in the world, instead of something that we're so frightened of.
And I'm sure that this conversation is going to make so many people uncomfortable because we're talking so openly about this topic, which is usually so taboo. And I'm curious, can you tell us a bit more about your profession now and how your work as a former sex worker informs that, and how your relationship to sex and shame?
Absolutely, I'd love to. So here's the irony. While I was working as a escort, and by the way, I also wear the label. During that time, I considered myself a sacred prostitute. I studied up on ancient sacred prostitution, was mentored in that by a woman by the name of Cozy Fabian, who just passed last year. She was part of my family, loved her dearly. Learned so much from her. I learned from her about ancient goddesses who were rebellious, like Lilith, who actually predates the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden. And getting a broader cultural perspective was really helpful for me. But so when I decided to leave the sex industry, I've changed a lot of careers over the time. For me, this was not because, oh, sex and it's terrible, I hate being an escort. It's time to write a book. I wanted to write a book. And I just have had a lot of precognition in my life. I knew I was going to get a book deal. I didn't know where it was coming from, but I knew it was coming. So I stopped escorting. I moved to a little cabin in the woods, and my marriage was failing, not because of the sex work, but because my husband was relapsing on prescription pills. And we'd been struggling with this for 5.5 years. And it was obvious that he just didn't really want to stay sober. So we got a divorce. And I moved to the mountains with just me and my 2 German shepherds. And I had bought 5 acres in the woods, and I lived up there for 8 years. Within 3 months of moving up there, I was contacted with a book deal through a major publisher. Penguin gave me an advance. I wrote a book called Sex Secrets of Escorts, which was published in 2005. It was kind of a big deal. My book party in San Francisco, a couple hundred people were in attendance, and the San Francisco Chronicle came to report on it. So that was fun. And then I made the arduous transition into becoming a relationship coach. I say arduous because of this stereotype and prejudice against former sex workers. Yeah. So obviously I had a high profile. I've been on every major network and all kinds of international television shows for 17 years. How do you transition from that? How do you go into another career? Suddenly I'm saying I'm a relationship coach. For a lot of people, that was kind of laughable. They would come to me to learn about sex. And I did get a certification through the American College of Sexologists as a certified sexologist. After that, I got a certification as an anger management coach. So I added that to my toolkit. How do people start to see you as having something worthwhile to offer? Some of that I just had to ignore the prejudice, ignore the fear, and move right through it. And I gradually won over my community. They gradually started to see me as a human being. It took patience. It took me staying open-hearted and helping them overcome their fear. What I know now is a lot of my clients value my history. They value the perspective. One of the things that they feel confident is that they can tell me anything, and I'm not going to judge them. I'm going to love them.
That's really touching to hear. And yeah, I think that that's so important. And I'm sorry that like your journey has been so difficult, because once, and not just you, but that in general, anyone who's done any sex work, if that suddenly gets revealed, that that's the only thing people can see about them, that's like a neon sign flashing on their forehead of like, this, I have had sex with people for money, or you know what other types of sex work there are as well. And so first of all, maybe let's talk a bit more about the different types of sex work for people who are like, okay, you're talking about sex work. We've talked about stripping and camming and things like that. But let's just, what does it actually mean to be a sex worker? What is sex work?
You know, I really want people to know that it's a service industry. And one of the things, so remember, I got clean and sober in a spiritual program 4 years before I became a sex worker. I brought prayer and meditation and tantra and breath exercises and embodied touch and healing into my practice. Does everybody? No. Do a lot of sex workers? Absolutely. They may not have been as intentional about it as me, but there's a lot of sex workers who feel that way. Rachel Wanton is a sex worker from Australia. She produced a gorgeous film about the sex workers in Australia who had formed a coalition specifically to work with clients who have disabilities. And they got trained in how to do bed transfers, how to work with people who were quadriplegic, paraplegic, had multiple sclerosis, all of this because they are about service and healing. And when she came to America to share her beautiful film, which is incredibly touching, it shows these people who are very compromised finally getting to have their first sexual experience, literally in tears about it. And in the embrace, in the loving embrace of these sex workers, it was so much cognitive dissonance for American audiences that they refused to allow her to call herself a prostitute. They said, you can't be a prostitute, you must be a nurse. And she called me up in frustration and says, you must educate Americans to the fact that prostitutes can be this way. So, Rachel Wanton, I'm doing that right now. I've been trying to do it ever since she asked me to. I want everybody to know that prostitutes really, for the most part, love and care about their clients and bring beauty to a sexual encounter and healing for people who are lonely, for people who, I had a client who saw me for a year before he told me that I was dying. That's the reality of sex work, is people being vulnerable and sharing some of their deepest, darkest secrets. They're never going to tell some of the people that are closest to them. But there's something, again, so if we look at sex as a beautiful thing, as actually a prayer, a meditation, a way to connect with the divine, which is what the ancients thought sex was. They really did think it opened a doorway to the divine. If we stop making sex something like going to the bathroom and start looking at it as this beautiful ascendant energy that we get to tap into, maybe then we would understand the sex workers do actually bring quite a bit of healing to their clients. And even the straight prostitutes do that. I really want people to know that. It doesn't really matter if you're white and college educated and working in a penthouse suite like me, or traveling around and meeting clients in 5-star hotels, riding around in limos. That was my life. You might be working a street corner. That does not mean that you don't love and care for your clients. I know strippers who brought the sacred, divine sexual healing to their clients.
Let's talk a little bit about, because you're talking about, you know, the difference between like high class escorts and street prostitutes and strippers. And I know that I was taught by my friend who was a sex worker about something known as a hierarchy. And so the hierarchy within
the horror. Well, that mostly exists in the minds of people who aren't sex workers. Mm-hmm. I've noticed that the movies and the television love to portray all this catty competition between sex workers, especially strippers. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I just never experienced that. What I experienced was a beautiful family that was very supportive. And I want to tell you why that could be true, why it might not just be anecdotally my experience. Because sex workers are isolated and demonized, and their lives are outlawed. So when they find each other, they become family. They have each other because they don't have, oftentimes, even their family of origin. They don't have their community. So that hierarchy is something that's imposed by the culture and by people on the outside of the industry. I really can't stress that enough.
And it's interesting as well, I was reflecting on what you were talking about earlier about the film that was made around sex workers and disabled people. And I think there probably are a few parallels, because disabled people are another group of people that are treated as totally subhuman and considered like people have a very us versus them feeling and a dehumanizing of like, you know, like, ooh, there's something like almost people think is icky about disabled people. And I'm disabled myself, and I was talking to Sophia Graham about disability on this podcast and was asking her about her clients, and she was saying she actually has a lot of sex worker clients, and that's something that's really important to her, is to amplify the voices of sex work and fight for decriminalization and sex worker rights as well as disability rights.
Yes, yeah, and there's this idea that sex is only for some people. So you can't have sex if you're ugly. You can't have sex if you're old. You can't have sex if you are in a wheelchair. You can't have sex if you are. I had a client who was born, he was what they called a thalidomide baby. That means his mom took this drug that caused him to be born without arms and legs. Everybody's sexual. And the thing about the part of us that wants and needs to be sexual will find a way. So let's say you've lost your legs or your genitals no longer work. That doesn't mean that you can't be a sexual being. Sex can find another set point in the body. It can relocate itself to your earlobes. And sex actually starts in the womb. We've got documentation of masturbation in utero. So it's really core to our being. And it's a beautiful thing. And if we can find a way to deal with the issues around consent and sexual assault and incest, maybe we can start to trust that. But because we don't understand how to have healthy boundaries, where the no is, where the respect for the no is, how to be able to speak the no, because we don't have that, we are terrified of sex. And we want to try to control it and constrain it into certain places where it's only allowed to take place there. And that actually leads to more sexual perpetration, because we are not opening up this conversation. We're not really moving into a shame-free reality around our sexuality. Shame-free does not mean everything's okay. Shame-free means we get to address this issue around consent and perpetration really in a substantial way. I'm an incest survivor. I'm a rape survivor. There is nothing more debilitating and damaging than having your consent ripped from you. And there's nothing worse than you could do to a child than to take that away from them. So I bring that message as a sex positive, former sex worker, sex rights activist, and somebody who's founded something called the Shame-Free Zone and wants to help enliven and enlarge people's sex lives. It is always in the context of healthy boundaries and finding our voice and being able to say no. I always say your yes is meaningless if you don't have a powerful no.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I'm gonna write that on a poster somewhere. And there's a few things I just want to address on what you've just said. And number one is when you talk about everyone's sexual, I hear that, like, I think people can be sexual in all forms, but I also want to acknowledge asexuality. That's for certain groups of people, they don't feel sexual, but that's got nothing to do with whether their gender or their disability or anything else. It's got to do with their own inherent sexuality.
And asexual people still can form romantic relationships, by the way.
Absolutely.
Some don't want to, some do.
Yeah.
So we don't want to paint that with a broad brush either.
No. That's not at all. I just want to acknowledge asexuality, and then of course there's also aromanticism, which sometimes goes hand in hand and sometimes doesn't with asexuality. But I love everything else you were saying about, how everyone who is not asexual, everyone who is sexual has the capacity to experience sexual pleasure, and that can take many different forms, and sex is beautiful and sex is spiritual and not this dirty thing that people think of it as. And I'm aware of time, but I'm just wondering if you can say a few words more around the kind of spiritual, beautiful connection to sex. And
I've absolutely. One of the things that I want to highlight when I say we're all sexual, I've got this really big definition of sex. So I consider the architect who builds a beautiful building is expressing his or her or their sexuality. Same thing with a gorgeous painting. Somebody who loves to plant fabulous gardens. To me, it's creative energy. And that creative energy can express itself in bonding with another person. It can express itself in creating another human life. It can express itself in art. It can express itself in professional accomplishments. That's what but see, that is a more spiritual approach towards sex, because I view it as that energy, that Kundalini energy that lives at the base of our spine. And I believe it wants to express itself through us in whatever way we're passionate about.
Which is why it's so crazy that all religions are so anti-sex, and anyone spiritual, that there's this separation between sexual and spiritual, and that if you're religious or spiritual, then you have to give up sex. And it's that sex can be your gateway to the divine.
Yeah. So when I am with my beloved, I think of it as my Holy Trinity. It's him, it's me, and it's the divine. And that's what we're communing with. And the type of sex that I practice at this particular stage in my life, which by the way includes some pretty athletic sexual intercourse, but it's, when I say the type, we're bringing in a lot of this elevated Kundalini energy. And we actually leave our bodies.
Wow.
And I think that is one of the most beautiful prayers you can pray, where you actually invite for me, my higher power, into the sexual union. And by the way, you can have sexual union while you're masturbating. It is about uniting with those elevated divine energies. However you hold those, however you see those.
And I'm really glad you brought that in as well, because I think people underestimate how important sex with oneself is. And I know that I've gone on a personal journey recently where I stopped thinking of masturbating as just a thing I do to help relax or go to sleep or whatever, and actually had sex with myself. And it's totally changed my relationship to sex in general, to sex with other people, by being able to connect and learn about how I connect to myself, what it is I like, how my relationship to eroticism and pleasure through sex.
It's so true, Jaya. I've found that I can use my self-pleasuring ritual to grieve the death of a loved one. I've done that. There is a way in which that orgasmic moment can really take us to the next level of whatever it is we're striving for. And also it's a great time, your brain is really open to information. And I love to introduce affirmations. So for me, I'm a visual person. I may visualize the next book or a beautiful trip or something that I want for the world, you know, peace, sending love out to people in other countries, where that energy goes out somewhere and you want it to create something beautiful.
100%. Veronica, I'm aware of time, but there's still a few more things I want to ask you. So number one is, do you have any advice for people who want to get into the sex work industry? Any advice for people who want to get out of the sex work industry?
It's a huge felony to give anybody advice on how to get into the sex industry, unless you put it in a book. Thank God we still have freedom of the press. But I talked about this with a colleague of mine years ago. I go, so I can't teach a class, but you can write a book. Okay, I'm confused. But I actually talked to an attorney about that years ago too. And it's true. In America, I cannot give that kind of advice, so I don't, which is really also really sad. You want to protect and rescue sex workers, but you don't allow them to tap into the wisdom of other sex workers who can help them stay safe. That should be criminal. But unfortunately, that's just the way it is right now. So what I would say is there are books. Check out some books. In particular, some written by my colleague, Amanda Brooks. The thing I would say about anybody wanting to leave is don't just automatically assume you should take my path. I'm a trailblazer. I've been doing this for decades. I made up my mind that I was going to blaze a path for other former sex workers where you would be able to transition to another career without having to hide what you used to do. Almost everybody is hiding it, by the way. And one of these days, when all the former sex workers get to come out of the closet, the world is going to be shocked at what they actually are doing for a living today. But for now, that'll just remain my secret. What I want you to know is that you get to choose. It's a harder path if you're going to be out. And I am so excited about the former sex workers who are choosing to be out right now, who are running for office, who are really founding their own companies and saying, I'm a former sex worker and I'm starting my own company because nobody else will let me work for them. Keep going. Keep going.
And how can people be allies and supportive to the sex work community? Because like we've established, people do have prejudices. So how can people,
It's easy. It's easy. Open your heart, open your ears, ask questions, listen, stop assuming. And if they tell you about other aspects of their lives, be curious about that, because they're a whole person. Don't just get all enamored and titillated by, oh, what's the strangest thing you ever did? And did your child know what you're doing? And how would you feel if your child became a prostitute? And okay, maybe you need to ask those questions because you have some curiosity about other things too, like what fills your heart? What are you passionate about? And, you know, what is your spiritual path? And who are you in love with? They're a person, a whole person. Be curious about all of them.
I love that. Remembering that the person in front of you is human, remembering that, educate yourself, keep an open mind, and stay connected to the humanity of people rather than making assumptions based on some label or some profession. I think that's super important.
Yeah, and if it helps you at all, I mean, if you are all about gay rights, just pretend they're gay.
And for people who are inspired to help support sex workers and like fight for decriminalization and sex worker rights, how can people do that? How can people get started with that?
Yes. Well, so there's a whole chain of sex worker outreach projects across the United States. There's one in almost every city. So it's SWAP for short, Sex Worker Outreach Project. And I am very proud to say that started in Australia, but I was there at its inception here in the United States. Robin Few, who passed on several years ago, founded that, and it took off like crazy. Look for the little red umbrella that also comes from the people in Australia. And Day of Remembrance, every December 17th. Shout out to Annie Sprinkle, who helped found that day, as well as Robin Few. I was at the very first one that took place in San Francisco. That is always a candlelit vigil for all the prostitutes who have been murdered. And if you really, really want to honor us, join us in grieving our dead.
And you've talked about the US and Australia. Is it the same acronym for other countries, or do you know?
Yes, it's all over. There are other sex worker rights organizations, but that's the one that's really kind of grassroots, and you can find one local, and it's better to go talk to the people who live in your area so you get to know your community. I also ESLERP, ESLERP, Erotic Service Providers, I always forget, Union. Maxine Dugan founded that. They are doing great work changing the laws in the United States. And educate yourself to the decriminalization that's taking place. Belgium just became fully decriminalized.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's good to know. And Veronica, how do you go beyond the boxes?
How do I what?
How do you go beyond the boxes?
How do I personally go beyond boxes? Well, first of all, I just want to say that, we've talked an awful lot about my past as a sex worker and about my identity as a sex worker rights activist. But I am an internal family systems informed relationship coach. So that's really where the bulk of my work is. Today, I'll be working with 2 clients. I will not be talking about sex work. I will not actually be talking about sex. I'm going to help somebody with some sexual abuse survivor issues. So I'm going to be working on their trauma. And I'm going to be helping somebody else with boundaries in their relationship. One of the things that I love about internal family systems is that we get to work with the parts of people and realize that no matter what has been done to them or what they've done, that they are a collection of parts of what we call subpersonalities. So that's one of the big ways that I go beyond boxes, is that I realize that people are not limited by what they've done or what's been done to them. And neither am I. So that might be something that we could all really benefit from, is bringing a little more of this idea of internal family systems. I think if we start looking at perpetrators that way, we'd realize that they're human too. So I'm on a mission to really bring the humanity back to all of us that are taking breath. That's just really important to me.
I love that. And how can people find out more about you and your work?
Come find me over on the Shame Free Zone, shamefreezone.com, theshamefreezone.com. It also, veronicamonet.com, all goes to one website. And send me an email. You can also find me on Facebook, the Shame Free Zone, or Veronica Monet. And my Instagram account is the Shame Free Zone.
Fantastic.
Happy to.
Thank you so much for your time today, Veronica. I feel like there was so much more that I wish we could have discussed, but hopefully you can come back for season 2 and we can talk about a lot more.
Love to. Thank you, Jaya, for having this beautiful Beyond Boxes portal. I think it's crucial.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And if people want to find out more about me and my work, my name is Jaya Bristow. You can find me at jayabristow.com or on Instagram at beyond_boxes.